Continuing from part 1, where I left off, our skeptic here, and if you haven't seen part 1, go back and watch it. That way what I'm about to say would make sense. Our skeptic objection here displays an incredible indifference to the actual process of textual composition in ancient times and matter of textual families. He has envisioned a single original, which was the source of all copies, when in fact the lack of materials and skilled scribes in ancient times dictates that there were very few copies made to begin with. So there were no instance of a single scribe transcribing the same error into thousands, hundreds, thousands, etc. manuscripts. What there would have been is a single scribe making an error once, an error which is then preserved as successive single manuscripts are transcribed until such time as mass copying procedures at schools existed, and then the error is preserved in thousands of manuscripts. It happened with Tacitus, it happened in the Bible. Now the skeptic might come back and say, well, if there were a copyist mistake, you can never be sure which figure was copied incorrectly. Was it the 40,000 figure that had been 4,000, or was it the 4,000 figure that should have been 40,000? Because you can never know for sure, you might as well just expunge these two parts of the Bible. One is definitely incorrect, and you never know which. In response, this of course is nonsense, as we have seen already. Beyond that, we should expunge the part of Tacitus that contains the numerical error. Now the skeptic comes back and says, well, it's very important is the fact that manuscripts contradict one another, and until the original is produced, the contradiction stands. Apologists are asking us to ignore the contradiction staring us in the face in favor of a theory that can in no way be substantiated. The fact is that the contradiction stands and will continue standing until evidence is produced to the contrary. The burden of proof lies on he who alleges. Because the contradiction is clear and obvious, I am under no obligation to prove a contradiction exists in manuscripts which apologists can't even prove existed. Apologists, on the other hand, are obligated to prove that there is no contradiction in the original writings, which they are wholly incapable of doing. In response, so likewise the error stands in Tacitus. And I could say Greco-Roman historians are asking us to ignore an error staring us in the face in favor of a theory that can no way be substantiated. The fact is that the error stands and will continue standing until evidence is produced to the contrary. The burden of proof lies on he who alleges, because the error is clear and obvious. I am under no obligation to prove an error exists in manuscripts which Greco-Roman historians and textual critics can't even prove existed. Greco-Roman historians and textual critics, on the other hand, are obligated to prove that there was no error in the original writings, which they are wholly incapable of doing. Of course, it would be amusing to see a skeptic reel out the spiel before an audience of professional historians and textual critics. These things said, we can now look further a bit at some related statements in issue 66 of the Biblical Inerrancy newsletter, which further show how little our skeptics know about the process of textual criticism. In addition to repeating some of the same errors as already alluded to, our skeptic writes, in addressing the first question in the prior issues, we noted that although there are thousands of manuscripts with similar and nearly identical texts, there is also thousands of variations. Because in a great number of differences, one would not be wise to assume that there must have been a common source. This is a glittering generality, and this glittering generality is derived clearly, quite uncritically, from skeptical sources like Stanton, who refer to 10,000s of blunders in the received text without any analysis of what these blunders consist of, whether or not they are obvious, whether they appear in one manuscript over and against several hundred that offer a more sensible and clearly correct reading, etc. It is an in-the-air objection and nothing more. Now, skeptics might come back and say, well, you know, encyclopedias and cookbooks also bear remarkable resemblance, and one might assume that they too have a common source. Although it is correct to say that the degree of similarity between biblical manuscripts is significantly higher than between most encyclopedias and cookbooks, the difference is of one degree, not kind. In response, of course, the difference is much greater than this, of course, and it is the height of incompetence to compare modern books in reference to ancient documents conceived prior to the advent of today's communication and exchange processes. This too is merely an in-the-air objection designed to convince our subject's more gullible readers that the skeptic has some relevant knowledge of the subject. One wonders if our skeptic's suggesting that each different manuscript, rather than being derived from a common source, was like a cookbook or an encyclopedia, each derived from an independent source that went out and did its own research and composition. The comparison implies a host of questions about what it is exactly the skeptic is trying to argue. It is well enough that the skeptic goes on further he goes no further into specifics, and of course that would badly upset the apple cart. Now, an additional note, however, I would like to make an additional note on approximations. No Tactian scholar would assert that Tactius was an error because the distance between the locations, as discussed already, were 23 5/10, or 124 7/10, or 126 2/10 miles apart, rather than precisely 125 miles. The capability of precision measurement devices is a relatively recent development, so that the approximations and round-offs cannot be regarded as errors. A general comment should be made about many biblical enemies' approach to numerical discrepancies such as these. It is irresponsible to take the standards of accountability that demand an exact agreement to the penny and apply them arbitrarily to ancient documents, many of which are many millennia old. This is not the right way in which to understand a document. Instead, harping on small differences between two slightly different numbers in parallel accounts is nothing but cultural and chronological chauvinism. Now, I've discussed it in depth in these two videos on copyist errors, the problem with basically the problem of dismissing outright text, or dismissing the whole Bible itself because of copyist errors. And that's been my attempt here. And again, as I stated, when I admit that there are errors in our modern day copies of the Bible, I am merely talking about transcription and copyist errors. I'm not referring to any type of logical or moral contradiction or error. And as I stated in the first video of this particular series, I plan on making several videos that will delve into a number of the moral or logical problems that skeptics have brought up here on YouTube. I hope this clears up the matter on copyist errors a little bit. Thank you for watching.